According to grandfather's description, this was the most gloomy time that Massachusetts had ever seen. The people groaned under as heavy a tyranny as in the days of Sir Edmund Andros. Boston looked as if it were afflicted with some dreadful pestilence, so sad were the inhabitants, and so desolate the streets. There was no cheerful hum of business. The merchants shut up their warehouses, and the laboring men stood idle about the wharves. But all America felt interested in the good town of Boston, and contributions were raised, in many places, for the relief of the poor inhabitants. "Our dear old chair," exclaimed Clara. "How dismal it must have been now." "Oh," replied grandfather, "a gay throng of officers had now come back to the British coffee house, so that the old chair had no lack of mirthful company." Soon after General Gage became governor, a great many troops had arrived, and were encamped upon the common. Boston was now a garrisoned and fortified town, for the general had built a battery across the neck, on the road to Roxbury, and placed guards for its defence. Everything looked as if a civil war were close at hand. "Did the people make ready to fight?" asked Charlie. "A Continental Congress assembled at Philadelphia," said grandfather, "and proposed such measures as they thought most conducive to the public good. A provincial Congress was likewise chosen in Massachusetts. They exhorted the people to arm and discipline themselves. A great number of minute men were enrolled. The Americans called them minute men, because they engaged to be ready to fight at a minute's warning. The English officers laughed, and said that the name was a very proper one, because the minute men would run away the minute they saw the enemy. Whether they would fight or run, was soon to be proved. Grandfather told the children, that the first open resistance offered to the British troops, in the province of Massachusetts was at Salem. Colonel Timothy Pickering, with 30 or 40 militia men, prevented the English Colonel, Leslie, with 4 times as many regular soldiers, from taking possession of some military stores. No blood was shed on this occasion, but, soon afterward, it began to flow. General Gage sent 800 soldiers to Concord, about 18 miles from Boston, to destroy some ammunition and provisions which the colonists had collected there. They set out on their march in the evening of 18 April, 1775. The next morning, the general sent Lord Percy, with 900 men, to strengthen the troops which had gone before. All that day, the inhabitants of Boston heard various rumors. Some said, that the British were making great slaughter among our countrymen. Others affirmed that every man had turned out with his musket, and that not a single soldier would ever get back to Boston. It was after sunset, continued grandfather, when the troops, who had marched forth so proudly, were seen entering Charlestown. They were covered with dust, and so hot and weary that their tongues hung out of their mouths. Many of them were faint with wounds. They had not all returned. Nearly 300 were strewn, dead or dying, along the road from Concord. The yeomanry had risen upon the invaders, and driven them back. "Was this the Battle of Lexington?" asked Charlie. "Yes," replied grandfather, "it was so called, because the British, without provocation, had fired upon a party of minute men, near Lexington Meeting House, and killed 8 of them. That fatal volley, which was fired by order of Major Pitcairn, began the War of the Revolution. About this time, if grandfather had been correctly informed, our chair disappeared from the British coffee house. The manner of its departure cannot be satisfactorily ascertained. Perhaps the keeper of the coffee house turned it out of doors, on account of its old-fashioned aspect. Perhaps he sold it as a curiosity. Perhaps it was taken, without leave, by some person who regarded it as public property, because it had once figured under Liberty Tree. Or, perhaps, the old chair, being of a peaceable disposition, had made use of its 4 oaken legs, and run away from the seat of war. It would have made a terrible clattering over the pavement," said Charlie, laughing. "Meanwhile," continued grandfather, "during the mysterious non-appearance of our chair, an army of 20,000 men had started up, and come to the siege of Boston. General Gage and his troops were cooped up within the narrow precincts of the peninsula. On 17 June, 1775, the famous Battle of Bunker Hill was fought. Here General Warren fell. The British got the victory, indeed, but with the loss of more than 1,000 officers and men." "Oh, grandfather," cried Charlie, "you must tell us about that famous battle." "No, Charlie," said grandfather, "I am not like other historians. Battles shall not hold a prominent place in the history of our quiet and comfortable old chair. But, tomorrow evening, Lawrence, Clara, and yourself, and dear little Alice too, shall visit the diorama of Bunker Hill. There you shall see the whole business, the burning of Charlestown and all, with your own eyes, and hear the cannon and musketry with your own ears." Chapter 8. The next evening but one, when the children had given grandfather a full account of the diorama of Bunker Hill, they entreated him not to keep them any longer in suspense about the fate of his chair. The reader will recollect, "that at the last accounts, it had trotted away upon its poor old legs, nobody knew whither." But, before gratifying their curiosity, grandfather found it necessary to say something about public events. The Continental Congress, which was assembled at Philadelphia, was composed of delegates from all the colonies. They had now appointed George Washington, of Virginia, to be commander-in-chief of all the American armies. He was, at that time, a member of Congress, but immediately left Philadelphia, and began his journey to Massachusetts. On the 3d of July, 1775, he arrived at Cambridge, and took command of the troops which were besieging General Gage. "Oh, grandfather," exclaimed Lawrence, "it makes my heart throb to think what is coming now. We are to see General Washington himself." The children crowded around grandfather, and looked earnestly into his face. Even little Alice opened her sweet blue eyes, with her lips apart, and almost held her breath to listen, so instinctive is the reverence of childhood for the father of his country. Grandfather paused a moment, for he felt as if it might be irreverent to introduce the hallowed shade of Washington into a history, where an ancient elbow chair occupied the most prominent place. However, he determined to proceed with his narrative, and speak of the hero when it was needful, but with an unambitious simplicity. So grandfather told his auditors, that, on General Washington's arrival at Cambridge, his first care was, to reconnoitre the British troops with his spy-glass, and to examine the condition of his own army. He found that the American troops amounted to about 14,000 men. They were extended all round the peninsula of Boston, a space of 12 miles, from the high grounds of Roxbury on the right, to Mystic River on the left. Some were living in tents of sailcloth, some in shanties, rudely constructed of boards, some in huts of stone or turf, with curious windows and doors of basket work. In order to be near the center, and oversee the whole of this wide-stretched army, the commander-in-chief made his headquarters at Cambridge, about half a mile from the colleges. A mansion house, which perhaps had been the country seat of some Tory gentleman, was provided for his residence. When General Washington first entered this mansion, said grandfather, he was ushered up the staircase, and shown into a handsome apartment. He sat down in a large chair, which was the most conspicuous object in the room. The noble figure of Washington would have done honor to a throne. As he sat there, with his hand resting on the hilt of his sheathed sword, which was placed between his knees, his whole aspect well befitted the chosen man on whom his country leaned for the defense of her dearest rights. America seemed safe, under his protection.